Over the past 2 decades, the UAE has built itself up as a regional economic hub. Global companies and business people would flock to its cities, along with countless migrant workers looking to fill its labor shortage. But now that could change. A document verified by Reuters shows that the UAE has halted new visas to 13 mostly Muslim countries. They include Turkey, Algeria, Tunisia, Pakistan, Kenya, and several others. A source told Reuters that the halt was over security concerns, but the UAE has not commented on the changes. The move comes just 2 months after Abu Dhabi normalized relations with Israel, which angered many across the Muslim world. But it's still unclear, at least officially, why these countries were specifically targeted. And joining me now from London is Ian Black. He is a visiting senior fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics. And also from London, Sami Hamdi is the managing director of the International Interest, a global risk and intelligence consulting firm. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Ian, since no official explanation been given, what could be the reasoning behind the UAE's visa ban on 13 mostly Muslim countries?
So it's a complicated story, as you've said, given the absence of any kind of official response from the UAE authorities. But I think that there are 3 factors that may explain it. One is security. The second is the COVID pandemic. And the third is attempts to restrict the large numbers of people who seek work in the UAE. And I think that I mean, I'm speculating, of course, but I think that the most likely explanation is some kind of security concerns.
Yes.
Whether that, but, you know, it's hard to imagine what that might be. Could be about the normalization agreement with Israel. It could be about the fear of Iranian or jihadi attacks, but that's, again, speculation.
So, Sami, what's your take on that? What threats were they talking about, to your opinion? A source told Reuters because that the visa halt, as just Ian mentioned, was due to security risks from the affected countries. What's your take on that?
I think the UAE is trying to present itself as being under threat for taking groundbreaking and trailblazing initiatives such as the normalization of ties with Israel. It's important to take this decision within the context, which is that you have French President Macron, the UAE's strongest ally in Europe, insistent on associating Islam with terrorism and trying to internationalize this threat between quotation marks. You have the Austrian Chancellor following Macron's lead in trying to pass a law to ban all forms of political Islam between quotation marks. And I think given now that we have Israelis who are visiting the UAE wants to say, look, I'm taking these trailblazing initiatives. I've compromised my entire standing in the Arab and Islamic world. I am now under threat for preaching these or aligning myself towards the ideas of peace that this backward region doesn't want to adopt. And as a result, Macron is correct. There is this threat of Islamic threat, and that's reflected in the fact that the UAE chose 12 Muslim majority countries to ban their visas. So I think this is part of a wider PR campaign for the UAE to say, look, I'm fully on board. I'm the only nation in the region you should be supporting, and I'm ready to take the risks associated with it.
Ian, does the timing of this decision have anything to do with Israelis now being allowed to travel freely to the United Arab Emirates? Do you think did the UAE feel there was a threat to them?
Again, I don't know. I happened to be on a webinar yesterday with an Israeli diplomat, and I asked him specifically about that question. And he said that in his opinion it wasn't connected, but it was it was an anonymous briefing, and the Israelis may of course be complicit in this arrangement. But I don't know, and I think that the key is to, in terms of responsible media activity, the thing is the central point is to insist on an official explanation from Abu Dhabi,
Yes.
and that I think is perfectly reasonable response to the countries affected.
So, Sami, what sort of a fallout can we expect from the Muslim world after this decision?
I don't think we can expect much fallout. I think there's a very difference between the response of the regimes and the response of the people. You have mass protests in Muslim countries over Macron's rhetoric, but you have seeming complicit approaches from the governments of the Muslim world who believe that their security is dependent upon a mandate secured from the international community, from the international powers, as opposed to from their local population. I think while the UAE today is vilified and being seen as having betrayed the Muslim world in its normalization of ties with Israel, the reality is that the US is expanding its military base in Qatar. Qatar is putting all of the finances up for it. Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia is contemplating normalization of ties with Israel in order to secure the buy-in of the Biden administration so that he can protect his bid to become king. The UAE has made it absolutely clear where it believes its mandate to rule lies, and that is in ensuring good ties with Tel Aviv and good ties with the White House. Algeria, which withdrew its ambassador because France insulted the army, is doing nothing with regards to France's association of Islam with terrorism. The reality is that until we talk about the region in the dynamics that actually underpin it, which is this security arrangement with an international order that is designed to protect stability and security between quotation marks, even if that comes at the expense of the popular will, I think we will see now that the UAE will become increasingly powerful in the region. It will be supported by the international powers. Biden has already said that he welcomes the UAE's groundbreaking moves towards normalization of ties with Israel. I think the reality is that the UAE is going to feel very empowered, and that the international order will recognize this narrative that the UAE is preaching, that I am the innovator in the region, I should be supported, and I am also at risk from these backward Muslims. And I think the international community will go with it.
So, Ian, do you agree? And which international powers are we talking about? And is it sustainable for the United Arab Emirates to side with the Western world, let's say, and Israel in particular, and stand against the fellow Muslims?
Well, of course, the UAE is the leader in a regional trend. Of course, the normalization with Israel also includes Bahrain, and maybe Sudan has expressed an interest in this and has gone public with it. The big question, to my mind, is whether the Saudis will follow suit. So there is a trend. There is fatigue in Arab government regimes with the Palestinian issue, and they're prioritizing their own interests, and particularly, of course, with the new Biden administration. But they're nervous about that, of course, because the president-elect has pledged, if you like, to renew the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran.
Yes.
So there's a complex story here. The UAE is certainly pursuing its own interests. An important part of the normalization agreement, though not officially linked, was the purchase of advanced F-35 warplanes from the US. So again, they're pursuing their own interests, but I think they do. There is a requirement to explain this controversial visa ban in their own terms and to come up with a reasonable explanation of it.
Yeah. So, Sami, what kind of ramifications would this decision will have on some European countries, particularly France, which foster anti-Islamic sentiments? And could this provide an opportunity for some countries to justify their Islamophobic stance?
When France banned the headscarf, it relied on Tunisia, which had banned the headscarf under Bourguiba, as Bourguiba sought to remove Tunisia from the Muslim and Islamic world and align more to the Western world as he sought a bid to rescue his economy and a bid to secure a greater integration with the more developed. In other words, France did not necessarily take the initiative on its own. It relied on Tunisia. The fear now is that Macron, who is on a rabid campaign to crack down, to create this enemy within that doesn't actually exist in order to rescue his political bid for the next elections, he's targeting the Muslims, and he will now rely on the UAE in pointing out and saying even a Muslim, moderate Muslim country, between quotation marks, is banning Muslims from entering its territory. So we, France, are not necessarily innovating in this. We're relying on the attitudes of Muslim countries. And herein lies the danger. And it's important to understand that the UAE's success in its foreign policy is built entirely on a rhetoric that is built on combating terrorism, between quotation marks, combating extremism, combating radicalization. Yes. Has always argued that if you allow democracy in the Middle East, you are enabling radicalism. And the reality is, the dark, very crude reality is, this rhetoric resonates in Paris, and not only Paris, but in Washington. It resonates in Berlin. It resonates across European capitals. And as we see in the UAE with the visa ban today, in the lack of outrage amongst the international community generally, the reality is that the UAE rhetoric, when the international order as it is weighs the balance, it believes that this combating or this securing of security and stability takes priority. It requires supporting the UAE and the authoritarian regimes in order to prevent a scenario whereby we might see these ideas that, quite frankly, we don't want.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk.